I think it's a great segue to talk about ICTs and then talk about my topic, which is research apps, more specifically. And this is something that has, emerged, not in the sense of emergence, but emerged in terms of its popularity very recently. And although I mentioned consent in my title, I think it's really important for us to look at this not from a really kind of informative, well, free and informed consent. Yes, everybody knows that, but perhaps taking an example of a consent issue. And in this case, I'll be talking about return of results more specifically. So I'm going to start with, I guess, a few realities. And then I'm going to go and talk a little bit about the role of the doctor, but also the notion of duality when it comes to research apps. And this is interesting. The Economist wrote a really nice piece in 2012 about squeezing out the doctor. And it talked about a few things that I'll be talking to you today, but one of them, obviously, is that we're going to be using technology more and more in our healthcare setting. But now that we are using it in research, to be able to perform research more efficiently is actually very interesting. And then I'm going to talk, as I said, about return of findings and propose a few practical issues that we can deliberate. This is pretty much a new topic as well for me. Research apps. This is something that I've started researching very recently, so it's going to be quite a preliminary deliberation for today. Talking about a few realities. The first one, obviously, is the empowerment of the consumer. This is something that we have heard a lot about and that we talk a lot about. And when it comes to empowerment, obviously, we try to make things a little bit more user-friendly, and we also see an increase in health literacy. A nice cartoon about, I actually know my diagnosis, but I came for a second opinion is something that we are seeing more and more today with websites in the past and now with actual health apps. Another reality that is perhaps more specific to research, and it also emerged in the field of genomics more specifically, is the one of altruism. Is the idea that I'm going to participate in research. I'm not going to get any benefits, or I'm not expecting any form of benefit, and I'm doing this for the common good. But while authors have discussed this notion of altruism sometimes in passing, and also seen it a little bit more in the terms of sacrificial, altruism, as in I don't want anything. Everything that I'm doing is for others. If we read the literature today, we also see a bit of self-interest in participation as well. And this is perhaps the notion of reciprocity, notion of exchange. And how can we balance, or how can we, pit two potentially contradictory things, altruism and self-interest? Well, authors have sort of discussed and argued that here, interest is not a condition of participation, but could be an incidental, result of it. Which brings me to the topic of today, so the research apps more specifically. And one of the perhaps common elements that we've seen in many of the presentations today is the idea that the doctors potentially in the future are going to have less and less role to play. And in that article from The Economist in 2012, it was really two avenues. The first one is we're going to see new professions be created, and they're going to be having more and more delegated acts that doctors in the past had reserved for them, but also the emergence of technology. And maybe this is a pun, but it's like we're talking about an apple a day keeps the doctor away, but it's a nap a day now that keeps the doctor away. So a bit of a background on health-related apps, and I'm going to do this very briefly. So there's approximately 165,000 health-related apps today. And a recent study by Water Cooper projects that by 2017, health apps will have been downloaded over 1.7 billion times. And this is also financially related. We're talking about global revenues that will reach approximately $21.5 billion in 2018, with Europe the largest market. But this is apps that are used for healthcare purposes. Now we are transitioning to apps that are more specific to research, apps that will potentially help researchers recruit much more people than they would normally fathom. But this is just an example of it. This is a research kit from Apple, and it's recently new. We're talking about 2015. And if we look at the different apps that are now in circulation, mostly in the United States, we can categorize them into two categories. First one is research apps that strictly use data collected by themselves, but also research apps that integrate data from external sources as well. So not only are they capturing new information, but they also will ask your permission to look at other apps that you have. And we all know, for those of you who have an iPhone, there's a health app that looks at how many steps you make per day, and if you want to insert information about your sleep pattern and so on, this is information that could potentially be accessed, obviously with your permission, by these different applications, research applications. And we know today that in the field of research, especially health research, being able to link information that we collect from participants with health outcome data is extremely rich. And this is potentially a way to do that. But when we are talking about squeezing out the doctor, at the same time, we are also talking about some form of duality. Right? And for those of you who are interested in expressionist German cinema, I really recommend you to watch this movie. It's amazing. And I'm going to take one example of it. This is an app called Mole Mapper. And it's studying melanoma in its early stages. So the idea is that participants or people who download this app, especially in the United States, will be able to take pictures, right? And those pictures will be sent to researchers, and researchers will be consolidating approximately from 10,000, 100,000 different participants and try to create algorithms for early detection. One of the interesting things about it is that, yes, there is a possible implication of a physician in the process, but it's not an obligation. And this is a research app, right? So it's really done for research. And I do this analogy with other projects that I'm interested in and participate in from a researcher perspective, those that during research the participants undertake MRI scans. So we will be seeing something in these scans, but the goal here is research. So the goal here is trying to advance knowledge. How do we balance all of that? What if we find something? What if we find a severe structural abnormality, for example? And in the process today, and this is obviously new, so it will be changing in the future, that's for sure. But it's really important for us to perhaps start looking at some of the issues that could arise. And in this case, the consent process is really done as a user-friendly process. Okay? ResearchKit is an open source platform. So developers will be able to go on a website and be able to see and look at different models, and they will create their own consent forms. But we're really looking at very general elements: withdrawal from participation, risks, benefits, and so on. But there are other things that fall into place given the nature of what we are collecting as information. And talking about that, we have to talk about the incidental finding dilemma. And this is not only a dilemma with technology, but it's also a dilemma when it comes to research ethics and research policy. So if we look a little bit at return of findings, there is no specific legislation or case law in Canada on this particular topic. But if we do we did a review of different normative policies in the field of genomics, yes, because it's probably the most advanced one in this field, we see that only 40% draw limitations associated with the research clinical care divide. And this is interesting because we often say that research today blur the research and the clinical settings, but the question is, do we have to blur the duties of researchers and clinicians at the same time? And this is Article 3.4 of the Tri-Council Policy Statement here in Canada, where we talk about incidental findings. And this is an obligation that was created by the three councils. Researchers have an obligation to disclose to the participant any material incidental findings discovered in the course of research. And when it comes to the definition of what a material incidental finding is, it's rather vague. We're talking about a finding that has significant welfare implications. But don't forget, we're talking here about an obligation to return these. There are, and this is recent, this article came with the 2010 revision of the policy, but in 2014 it was changed, and I'm also involved in the subcommittee that is actually looking at this article to modify it as well. So it's constantly in motion, but in 2014 we've added an exception to this. And one of the examples is when the group is very large or its members are likely to be deceased, geographically dispersed, or difficult to track. And this brings us to the use of technology, use of apps, if we can ever argue that this could fall in that realm. But the topic of return of findings is not one that is only related to consent. Okay? For many years, if we look back at 1996 and some of the early policies that have discussed return of research findings and incidental findings, we see that they've conflated the two notions. Return of results or return of findings usually refer to findings that we expect from the research. But when we talk about incidental findings, these are findings that we find during our research project that have nothing to do with the scope of the project itself. And earlier on, we're talking about them as being one. And today we are seeing more and more nuances. But if you look back at Article 3.4 that I've just mentioned, we talk about an obligation to return, but we don't talk about the consent of the participant, whether or not they would like to receive such information. And this brings me to the practical issues related to this, which is it's not only about consent, but also what happens before consent and what happens after consent. And this is something that research apps and mobile technology will have to take into consideration. Yes, there is a need to be user-friendly, but at the same time, there are things that we need to capture. So it really starts before the consent. It really starts at the initial drafting of the protocol when we think about return of results. And one of the obligations of the Tri-Council policy statement is actually to have a plan submitted to the Research Ethics Board. Now the question comes, well, this is an open source platform. Everybody can potentially create an app that is for research purposes and capture. So how do we make sure that they go through a Research Ethics Board review? In Quebec here, the Code Civil du Québec has changed in 2013 to actually require this for every research project. This is something that has also changed recently. When it first came out, there was no obligation whatsoever for a Research Ethics Board review, but in the iTunes agreement in Apple, recently the developer agreement has added a requirement for everyone who's doing or creating or developing an app that is for research to have the Research Ethics Board involved. So we're seeing this constant motion in this field as well. When we think about return of results and return of findings, it has to be done at the research protocol level. And when we think about a plan, the plan does not necessarily mean returning findings. Okay? Remember, 3.4 talks about exceptions. So you can have a plan where you're not going to be returning findings, but you have to explain that to your Research Ethics Board and get the approval. And one of the important things related to this is to have, if you are returning something, to have an internal policy for consistency purposes. Because most probably, and as Professor Joly has mentioned, we're talking about internalization of research. So what happens in one site, you need it to happen the same way in another site to be able to have some form of consistency. And if feedback is foreseen, you have to explain to the participant how this is going to be done. Not necessarily in details, but they need to have some information. Is there going to be a committee that's going to be looking at that? Yes or no? When it comes to the consent itself, researchers must clearly indicate whether they will be returning the findings or not. And if there is a plan to return, participants should be provided with the option of not receiving the findings. Okay? Because again, here they're doing this for research purposes. They're not doing this to get care. And this is the importance of being very nuanced. And if findings are returned, the feedback process should be explained. Okay? Again, as I mentioned, MoleMapper suggests a role for physicians, but it's not an obligation. And some research projects where we have potential clinical information that will be revealed, we have a physician involved in the process. And in this case, it's really important to have that notion pretty much inscribed in the way it is presented to the, in this case, the consumer participant. So the type of findings to be returned should be also delineated. And the reason for that is you want to make sure as well, because we're talking a lot about the participant, but also for the researchers, it should not be an onerous undertaking either. We can't be saying, well, we'll return everything to you. You have the right to have access to the information, but that's not the same as when you receive it in another form, in an interpreted form. And researchers must clearly lay out their limitations. It's really important to have something very clear about that this is done under a research protocol. It's done for research purposes. It has not been done for diagnostic purposes. So put in the limitations very clearly. And finally, when it comes to after consent, we have to talk about the communication itself. How is that going to be done exactly? Okay? And again, simple clicks, next, 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 next on a phone will not be able to capture this for now, so we have to think about this. When you communicate back information to your participant, it has to be in short and lay terms for the participant. I've seen projects, for example, where participants receive letters that talk about a mass, but in a certain area of the body. But what does that mean for the participant? We're going to get very anxious, not able to know what to do and who to contact. So it needs to be short and in lay terms, but not too simplistic either. Okay? And when you have a physician involved in the process, well, it has to also be short, but here a little bit more technical in nature. So you need to be able to inform the physician who's related to your participant, right? And you have to abstain from providing clinical recommendations because there's a limitation to doing that, right? And here I'm talking about research apps, but I've seen many healthcare apps that are practically giving a diagnosis, okay, at this level, and there is no doctor involved. Again, when you communicate, you have to reiterate the limitations associated with the findings, and the communications should respect the choices of the participants. Some participants have said no, so you're not going to be returning to them anything if that's the case. So these are all very important things to keep in mind and remember. And again, for those of you who've seen Steve Jobs' movie, there's really a very interesting scene when he talks about the computer and how it looks like a human face, and it says it needs to say hello. Well, it's all about trust, basically, and being able to integrate these technologies in a very proper way, because obviously they have their benefits in this case. When we have a research project that's only been able to recruit 100, 200, maybe 1,000 max, and is able to recruit tens of thousands of people, it does have its advantages, but it has to be done efficiently, equitably, and ethically. So, thank you very much.